Let's continue our conversation about weeds by talking about some general ways that we classify them in order to better understand their growth habits and therefore how to manage them. So here we go with a brief overview of weed classification. We can start by placing weeds into two general categories. Weeds can either be grasses or broadleaf. Now, in this context, when we're talking about grasses or broadleaf, we're not being very scientific. We're just mentioning plants that look like grass. They grow tall and skinny with narrow leaves, or broadleaf is anything else that has a flat leaf, kind of like the typical plant that you would draw when you're in kindergarten. So what are some characteristics of these two general categories of plants? Grasses will germinate with only one cotyledon. Cotyledon is the leaf that is held inside of the seed. So we call grasses monocots. In fact, whether a flowering plant is a monocot or a dicot is one of the fundamental ways to categorize flowering plants. And that's basically what we're doing here with our weeds. In addition to having a single seed leaf or cotyledon, monocots or grasses generally have veins of leaves parallel, meaning they typically run vertical along the blade of the grass in the same direction or orientation as the leaf. The root systems are typically netted, shallow, netted roots, and flower parts are often in threes. This includes lilies and irises and anything that's generally a monocot. We would call them monocots, or unscientifically, we would just call them all grasses when we're referring to weeds. Broadleaf, on the other hand, they germinate with two cotyledons, and so they're referred to as dicots. They have veins that are netted in the leaf, so you have a characteristic branching pattern where the veins of the leaves do not all run in the same direction. Instead, they spread out along the surface area of the leaf. Root systems begin as a tap root, and the flower parts may be in many formations, but very commonly they're in fours or fives. Now, these are just general observations. There are always plants that will break the rule, and these are important for a number of reasons. First of all, you need to be looking for grasses and broadleaf weeds, but also the way you may choose to control for each of these two classifications is different, both in the mechanical control, how you would physically remove the plants, or if you're going to use an herbicide, you would want to make sure that the chemical that is being selected is appropriate for that type of plant. And if we break down our weeds even further by plant family, we can see that in general, out of hundreds of plant families, there are two primary families that will contain the vast majority of the weedy species that we will encounter in the landscape. The largest plant family that contains weedy plant species is the grass family, Poaceae, POA. 40% of weeds are in that family. They're fairly easy to differentiate from other families because they look like grass. The next highest plant family is Asteraceae, or the sunflower family. And these are any flowering plant that produces a flower that looks kind of like a daisy or a little sunflower with the petals and the disc in the center. Anything in that family is part of the Asteraceae family. And 30% of our weeds come from that family. So if you only learn those two plant family characteristics, you can recognize about 70% of the landscape weeds. And again, this becomes important because we can select control methodologies that are fine-tuned for these specific plants and their biology, so that if we implement a control measure, regardless of whether it's chemical, biological, mechanical, whatever we implement, we can try to select for the specific group of plants that we're trying to target. And then the rest of the plants will be left unharmed. Now, there's one other way that we can broadly classify our plants, and it's by looking at their life cycles. There are 3 general types of life cycle that we recognize, and it doesn't matter what family, whether a monocot or a dicot, they can all behave in one or more of these categories. So what are the general life cycles of these plants? Well, first of all, we have annuals. An annual is any plant that grows in a single season. And more specifically, it will complete its reproductive cycle in 1 year. So it'll sprout from a seed, it will grow, flower, and spread seeds all in 1 year. And that is different from our next life cycle category, which is biennial. A biennial plant requires 2 years to complete the life cycle. In the first season, usually a basal rosette or just a round arrangement of leaves is produced. And in the second year is when the plant will flower and die. And this is different still from our third life cycle, which is perennial, meaning the plant can live indefinitely, year after year, or as long as it's longer than 2 years, we call it perennial. Perennials may reproduce both by seed and vegetative reproductive structures, meaning if a branch breaks and falls off some other place, it can develop roots in that other place. So you would have vegetative reproduction, or you can also have viable seeds that are from perennial plants. All 3 of these life cycles will give you additional clues on how to manage weeds in the landscape. For example, an annual plant is going to grow and die in a single year, and your goal for preventing future weeds is to stop the seed drop. We don't want more seeds to develop. So we're trying to prevent that annual from releasing its seeds. The biennial, we've got a little bit of a longer time before we can act on the plant. It's very helpful to know if you need to do something this year or if you can wait until next year. And with perennials, they're going to be around year after year. And so we can develop different strategies for how to keep them under control, preventing their spread that may be slightly different from our annuals and our biennials. Certainly with the perennial plants, there will be an effort to prevent vegetative reproduction as well. And finally, it's important to remember that these life cycles of a species, they might vary with the environment. For example, if you're in a climate that has a deep freeze or a very cold winter, there are plants that by nature might be perennial. They could live multiple years, but in that cold climate, they'll adapt and they'll act or behave like annual plants. And vice versa, if you're in a warm climate, there are certain weeds that act like annuals in other places, but if you never get cold winters, you may have that annual plant surviving, continuing on into subsequent years. It's important to know that these weed species may take on variable life cycles. That's one of our weedy characteristics, isn't it? Adaptability to a broad range of conditions. So there we go with a very brief overview of how to generally categorize weed species when you approach a landscape. And this categorization is helpful for identification. Additionally, it's helpful for selecting appropriate management methods so that we can really target in to those weedy species we want to control and then allow the desired plants to flourish.